Yeah. Hey, we did good yesterday. Let's do good again today. Here we go. Let's keep it going.
When it comes to wrestling, history can often repeat itself, something which is most commonly the case with storylines being reused. We are talking about things such as CM Punk threatening to leave Ring of Honor with the world title in 2005 and then recreating the Summer of Punk in 2011 WWE. But it's not always angles that repeat themselves. No, sometimes it's the characters themselves. And it's those characters we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the dual stories of Mick Foley and Sami Zayn. Yes, back during the turn of the millennium period, there was no more lovable underdog in wrestling than Mrs. Foley's baby boy. And the reason for that was because with his shaggy dog looks and his too nice for wrestling personality, it seemed like there was no way he was ever going to reach the top of the card in the shark-infested waters that were the WWF locker room. But in the end, Mick did reach the top of the card. Hell, by the time all was said and done, he'd be a three-time WWF champion, and not just that, he'd be among the bigger stars of his era, only a step below people like Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. How does this compare to Sami Zayn's career in the modern day? Well, it's remarkable how similar things are because, like with Foley, Zayn also felt like someone who was always going to have a ceiling in WWE, largely on account of him not really fitting the mold for what Vince McMahon saw in a top star. But then something happened in the summer of 2022. Vince left the company for the first time, and that opened the door for the Quebec native to take his lovable underdog act all the way to the main event scene as part of the Bloodline. That's right, by leaning into his more comedic side, Sami was able to do exactly what Mankind had done all those years prior with Mr. Sacco, becoming one of the biggest babyfaces in all of WWE. Sure, he might not have won a world title yet, but there is still time for such a thing to happen. And if and when it does, it will fully solidify the honorary Oos as being the modern-day Mick Foley, complete with shaggy looks and personality so lovable, it's impossible not to get behind him every time he comes out through the curtain. But Sami Zayn isn't the only current-day WWE superstar who serves as a modern-day counterpart to a performer from a previous generation. No, the exact same thing could be said when talking about our next subjects too, Seth Rollins and Triple H. Now, on the face of things, this one might not seem so obvious as the Architect and the Game are very different performers in the ring. But one of the things they certainly do have in common is that they are both the leaders of stables which look set to not just dominate Raw, but also build the future of the brand while they're at it. That's right, we all remember that back in the early 2000s, Triple H was riding high on the Red brand as the World Heavyweight Champion. And a big part of the reason he was able to do this was because he had Evolution by his side. Who were the other members of Evolution? Well, if for any reason you've forgotten, they were Ric Flair, Randy Orton, and Dave Bautista. Obviously then, while part of the goal of this stable was to keep Paul Levesque on top, another part of the goal was to make Orton and Batista stars too. And this is something which is currently being echoed on WWE TV and what Seth Rollins has been doing since WrestleMania 41. Why is that? Well, after aligning himself with Paul Heyman at this show, he'd quickly form a stable which also included current up-and-coming star of tomorrow, Braun Breaker. Obviously, then the plan here is clear, and that plan is twofold. One, turn Seth into a modern-day version of Triple H as he goes about running the Raw brand with a stable of muscle behind him helping him every step of the way. And two, the plan is also seemingly to do with Braun Breaker what Evolution did with Randy Orton and Dave Bautista all those years ago, transform him into a main event star who can go on to the top of the card for years to come in WWE. Will this be successful? Time will tell, but given how talented Breaker is, there's no reason he shouldn't be in that spot. No, we could easily see him main eventing WrestleMania within the next few years, and if that happens, the comparisons between Evolution and this modern-day version of the Dangerous Alliance will be fully there, as we'll have seen the latter be able to truly build up that next generation, just the same way Triple H and Ric Flair did back in the day. Hell, so good of a job would they do at this back in the early to mid-2000s, Batista would end up getting a modern-day counterpart of his own. And that counterpart is none other than our next subject, Braun Breaker. Yeah, this one bears going into in a little more detail because it really is astounding how many similarities there are between these two performers. Sure, the obvious comparison to make when we're talking about Bronson Steiner would be either his father Rick Steiner or his uncle Scott Steiner, but in truth, he's got a lot more in common with Big Dave. Why is that? Well, Back in the day, Big Dave was able to have a meteoric rise to the top of the card in WWE, largely because while he was still relatively inexperienced at the time, he was dripping in so much charisma and had such an impressive powerhouse moveset, it was impossible to ignore him. And these facts were only further emphasized once he joined Evolution and, in many ways, became the real breakout star of that stable, even more than Randy Orton. Come on now, it was Batista who would go on to defeat Triple H for the World Heavyweight title at WrestleMania 21 in the climax of the best storyline of that era, not the Viper. And it's Dave who would in many ways become the face of SmackDown in the years following. Obviously then, WWE are hoping history repeats itself here with Braun Breaker, as they're certainly sending that young rookie down the same path of being the muscle in a stable of more experienced workers. But then why wouldn't Braun be the muscle here? After all, like with Dave Batista, he's overflowing with charisma, and also like the Guardians of the Galaxy star, he has one of the most impressive power move skill sets out there. Just look at that spear he recently gave to Carlito on an episode of Raw if you don't believe us. We'd go as far as to say that wasn't even a spear, it was a full-blown missile. So given he has all these things going for him then, it seems likely that barring something like a catastrophic injury, Braun will be able to follow in the footsteps of Batista by eventually breaking away from his stable and becoming a babyface star, something which will probably happen when he turns on the dastardly Seth Rollins at some point. And after that, world titles and WrestleMania main events, no doubt. That's right, the future looks bright for the dog-faced gremlin, so bright that we struggle to imagine him not being a top guy in WWE for many years to come at this point. All he needs is that big angle to skyrocket him up those final few rungs, perhaps something which involves him giving a thumbs down to the architect and from there proceeding to spear his soul out of his body. But what about the other rookie of Evolution, Randy Orton? Surely he was also good enough to merit having a modern-day counterpart? Well, yes he was, and that counterpart for our money quite simply has to be Miles Bourne. Now when it comes to these two, the comparisons in many ways are obvious. After all, back during the 2000s, Randy Orton was able to rise all the way to the top of WWE in short order with a style that was very calculating and conniving in its nature. Sure, he could get explosive whenever he needed to, but for the most part, the Viper was happy to take his time and go at a leisurely pace, gradually picking apart his opponents with a well-placed draping DDT or headlock. And once the time was right, it would usually be an RKO out of nowhere, which put the final nail in the coffin of the person standing on the opposite end of the ring from him. How does this compare to how Miles Bourne operates in 2025? Quite a lot as it happens, because anyone who's seen any of the rookies' matches will know that they share a lot in terms of their in-ring style. And not just that, they also share a lot in terms of their physique and overall looks as well. Hell, even their ring gears are similar, and that's led a lot of people to rightfully consider Bourne to be a modern-day incarnation of Orton. Obviously, though, it still remains to be seen if the youngster from North Carolina will be able to have the same success as the 14-time world champion by time all is said and done. But if what he's given us so far is any indication, he's certainly going to be pushing hard to follow that same path. And we can say that with confidence because over the course of his run down in NXT so far, he's already been able to have some impressive matches as part of the No Quarter Catch crew stable. Really then, the only question left is will Miles Bourne be able to go all the way to the top like Randy Orton did before him? And if he does, how long will it take him to do this? We'll all have to wait and see. But let's move away from Ruthless Aggression era stars for now and over to Golden era ones instead, as it's there we find our next great legend and their modern-day counterpart, Rowdy Roddy Piper and CM Punk. Now, longtime fans will be all too aware that back in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, there was no one out there quite like Roddy Piper. It didn't matter if it was his run in places like Portland, where he tore things up on a regular basis, his time in Jim Crockett Promotions, where he had a legendary dog collar match against Greg Valentine at the first ever Starrcade, or his most notable run in WWF, where he became a part of the inaugural WrestleMania main event alongside Hulk Hogan, Mr. T, and Paul Orndorff. He was always a must-see performer. And not just for his wrestling either. No, perhaps even more so than this, what Piper really excelled at was his promo skills. All it took was a microphone in his hand and you knew you were going to get something special as he proceeded to absolutely scorch his opponents with lines like, "You do not throw rocks at a man with a machine gun," or "Just when they think they have all the answers, I change the questions." Needless to say then, this turned Roddy into an absolute legend of the industry. Sound similar to someone today? Yes, like with Piper, Punk has long since proven himself to be a top-tier promo, with this part of his game in many ways being his strongest suit overall. Honestly, if you told us Punk took a lot of inspiration from the kayfabe Scotsman in the way he handles a mic, we would believe you. Yes, ever since returning to WWE in 2023, Punk has regularly went to war in promo segments and holding his own with just about everyone, much in the same way Roddy was able to do back in the day, regardless of who he was standing on the opposite end of the ring from. Really, the main difference we can think of between these two is that while CM Punk is a multiple-time world champion across various different promotions at this point, Roddy Piper is one of those notable legends who never managed to hold the top prize around his waist, no matter what territory he was in. Thankfully, though, not winning world titles wouldn't be a problem for our next subject, Shawn Michaels, just as it wouldn't be a problem for his modern-day counterpart, AJ Styles. That's right, this one seems almost too obvious to include, but we simply have to because the comparison is so apt. After all, back in the 90s, there was a solid argument to be made for Shawn Michaels being the best wrestler in the world, something he proved with his unique high-flying offense and excellent understanding of ring psychology. And because he was so good at wrestling then, he was able to ascend all the way to the top of the mountain in WWF by becoming world champion on multiple occasions, something few would have thought possible for him when he was first getting started, largely on account of his size. Yes, the reality of the matter is that in wrestling, size is always going to be important. And that's what makes HBK's ability to convince Vince McMahon that he was a worthwhile guy to build the company around back then all the more impressive. But this wouldn't be the only time such a thing occurred with a relatively undersized performer, because when AJ Styles joined WWE in 2016, history would repeat itself in short order. Of course, for anyone who'd been watching the Phenomenal One in the years prior to his WWE debut, though, this was well-deserved as he'd long since proven himself to be a world-class talent in places like TNA and New Japan. But none of that necessarily meant anything to Vince McMahon, and so when AJ went to WWE during the mid-2010s, there was some fear about how he would be presented. Thankfully then, Vince would very quickly realize what he had in Styles, and what he had was the closest thing we'll likely ever get to a modern-day Shawn Michaels. So upon seeing this, Vince pushed AJ to the moon to the point that despite being a small guy in the land of the giants, he'd end up pinning John Cena and then winning the WWE title from Dean Ambrose all before his rookie year on the roster was over. Obviously then, this would make him a made man going forward, just as winning the WWF title made Shawn Michaels a made man back in the day. Really, the only thing we wish we could have seen was these two have that dream match we all hoped for before all was said and done. But with HBK only wrestling one match since his retirement in 2010, a tag team bout pitting him and Triple H against The Undertaker and Kane, the stars have never aligned in the right way for this to take place. But let's move away from disappointment over missed opportunities for matches for now, and on to disappointment over missed opportunities for characters instead, as back in 2003 we certainly had an example of that in Sean O'Haire. Luckily though, in the modern day, it seems someone might be picking up the mantle of this gimmick, someone who goes by the name of Karrion Kross. Okay, let's back up and offer a bit of context. It was in 2003 that Sean O'Haire, someone who'd come over to WWE as part of the invasion following the WCW buyout, started working out the kinks of an all-new character, one which was pretty different to everyone else around him at the time. Why was this? Well, because rather than focusing on his power and strength when he was in matches, O'Haire attempted to enact psychological warfare against the roster in backstage segments instead, with him usually being there to whisper in the ear of someone and, like a devil on their shoulder, convince them to do things they shouldn't be doing. And so the Devil's Advocate was born. Unfortunately though, before this gimmick could reach its full potential, it would be snuffed out when Shawn became more of a lackey to Roddy Piper than anything else. But this wouldn't mark the end of WWE's attempts to ever do something with a Devil's Advocate-style character again. No, flash forward to present-day WWE and we're seeing history repeating itself in many ways. This time, however, it's not O'Haire in the role, though sadly he died in 2014. So instead, we've got Karrion Kross picking up the mantle as a guy who tries to get in the head of people during backstage segments by enacting psychological warfare on them. Will the gimmick work out this time? Well, that remains to be seen. But thus far, it certainly seems to have given Kross's career a boost, and it is very entertaining to watch. So maybe it just goes to show that what Sean O'Haire was doing back in 2003 really was ahead of its time. But what about our next subject, Jacob Fatu? Well, he's been taking a lot of inspiration from a family member of his and his uncle, Umaga. Now, we all know the long history of the Anoa'i family, one of wrestling's premier lineage, along with the likes of the Harts, the Guerreros, and the Von Erichs. So it should come as little surprise that two members of this family tree have a lot of similarities in how they operate, as they are quite literally bound by blood. What are those similarities? Well, during the mid-2000s, as a heel behemoth, Umaga was able to get massively over during his matches with John Cena. That's right, in 2005, there was simply no denying Edward Fatu. So when he found himself in the main event scene for a while as the crazed and brutal Samoan who is overflowing with both charisma and in-ring skill, it surprised no one. And it obviously served as a big inspiration for his nephew Jacob, as years later, he'd choose to go down the exact same path when he became a wrestler himself. And we mean that when we say it because Jacob Fatu is very much presented as a brutal Samoan badass too, one who has arguably even more charisma and in-ring skill than his uncle. But then this will come as no surprise to anyone who's been following his career since its early days, because as far back as his time in Major League Wrestling, where he was winning that promotion's top prize, the Samoan Werewolf was showing himself to be a generational performer. The only question left then is, as the years go on, will Jacob Fatu be able to fully realize that potential by doing what his uncle never could, and that's win a world title in WWE? We'd say there's a pretty high probability that this will be the case. Sure, it's a shame Umaga wasn't able to live long enough to see Jacob become the 2.0 version of him. We've no doubt it's something which would have made him very happy to see, but at least Umaga's brother and Jacob Fatu's father, the Tonga Kid, is still around, and he can be proud on his siblings' behalf. Yes, Sam Fatu will no doubt be watching his son's career progression very carefully, and possibly even giving him pointers on what he can do to be more like his uncle along the way. After all, when we're talking about the Anoa'i family, keeping that legacy alive is very important to them. But let's move away from Samoa for now and over to England instead, as it's there we find our next legend and their modern-day counterpart, two stellar technical wrestlers who first made their names on the UK scene, but who later went over to WWE. Who are we talking about here? Why, William Regal and Pete Dunne, of course. Now, William Regal is another figure who any old school fan will be all too familiar with, because for the last few decades, he's been building the reputation for himself as the perennial wrestler's wrestler. Obviously then, this meant he'd have a very good career over the years, a career which saw him go all the way from the world of sports days of the UK to the bright lights of America in companies like WWF and WCW, all while showing off a technical mat-based style. That said, he wouldn't be the only one doing this as the years went on, because following Regal's retirement, a whole new crop of British talent would rise to the forefront, and the one who aped the OG villain style the most would have to be Pete Dunne. That's right, whether we're talking about his early days in places like Progress and Rev Pro, or his later move to WWE via the NXT UK pipeline, he's fully lived up to his name of the Bruiserweight by not only tying up his opponents in deadly submissions and threatening to break their fingers at every turn, but also by laying in a stiff strike whenever necessary. And like with Regal, this has seen Dunne gain a reputation as a bit of a wrestler's wrestler, someone who might never win a world title on a national level, but who will always have the respect of his peers for being one of the best people to be in the ring with. But what about someone who makes use of strength not in their hard-hitting moveset, but in the sheer size and power of their physique? Well, that's something which would not only apply to former WWF champion Diesel, but also the woman who in many ways is his modern-day counterpart, Raquel Rodriguez. Yes, both have followed very similar career paths. After all, Diesel first gained notoriety back in the mid-90s when he was acting as the heater to a smaller teammate in Shawn Michaels, with him here using his size in order to further intimidate any opponents HBK had at any given time. And that's the same role Rodriguez has served during the early days of her career too, either as the muscle for Dakota Kai on NXT or for Liv Morgan on Raw. That said, as we all know, Kevin Nash wouldn't remain the silent heavy forever. No, by the time late 1994 came around, he'd very much be getting a push to the top on his own merits, with him at this point going as far as to win the WWF title when he squashed Bob Backlund in just 8 seconds during a live event in Madison Square Garden. And after that, he'd go on to hold the title for the better part of a year. Does this mean we can expect to see Raquel do the same herself soon by breaking away from Liv Morgan and going after the world title currently being held by Io Sky? We guess we'll just have to wait and see. But if history has taught us anything, it's that there is a pretty good chance this will happen. Even if this doesn't happen though, the comparison between Rodriguez and Diesel remains an apt one, as both just have too many similarities to be ignored. And we fully expect both of them are aware of this, as Raquel seems only too happy to have played up to being something of a big mommy cool in recent years, especially now in her role as the heavy of the Judgment Day. But then what else would you expect someone to do when they're getting compared to a former legend? It's the kind of thing every wrestler dreams of.
I was expecting that Dominic Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero reference. Um, Too many similarities. Him with Ray, I think the only thing with him and Ray got is that 619, and yeah, that's about it. Um, Anyways, we're gonna get out of